You may not have heard the story of William Odom, but you remember the horrific error he made in the Big Bayou Canal off Mobile Bay in Alabama. On the 22nd of September of 1993, the eastbound Sunset Limited, Amtrak's finest passenger trains, plunged off the bridge and derailed into the bayou, killing 47 victims and injuring 103. The horrendous aftermath of Odom was to a clinical level. He couldn't stay in his own home. He was taken to a psychiatric hospital for extreme depression and horrifically emotional episodes. He could not be on camera for a fear of retaliation, but he spoke via phone call to CBS Evening News headquarters, Jeff Cohen, as our longtime 60 Minutes 2 correspondent David Hawkins reports. At around 2:45 a.m., Amtrak Sunset Limited was rising through the coast of Mobile, Alabama, when a violent collision and derailment changed radar qualifications forever. William Odom was piloting the Movilla. At the time, radar readings were not yet implemented at the time and year of the bridge derailment. Odom spoke to CBS Evening News and 48 Hours mystery correspondent Bob McNamara. In a document, he said, "I was horrified and frightened as hell as I watched the Sunset Limited derail off the bridge. What scared me the worst was worse than being in state prison, where the fatalities and injuries aboard the train. The FRA inspectors confirmed everything that fell into the river would be scrapped immediately. I was so heartbroken when I was laid off from the Movilla, but I'm blessed after all these years because of my honesty and cooperation with NTSB officials that no criminal charges would be pressed on me." Lab samples from the wreck were taken to Washington, D.C., where the cause of the accident would be later revealed. Robert Lobby, who was an NTSB chairman at the time, said there were many red flags in the disaster. For instance, there were no lights on the trestle when the train hurled itself off the rails. Second, it was the lack of safeguard protection in the channel, including were a sign of bridge plates under the concrete piers. The bridge plates helped the bridge to be fastened to avoid dislodgement. When the Movilla hit the bridge plates were nowhere to be found. Unaware, the bridge girder was accidentally shoved in the center of the rails, which caused the fatal disaster. Fires were instantaneously started after the fuel tanks of all three locomotives ignited. The pools of diesel fuel and journal grease littered the Mobile Bay. Flames almost burned for 7 hours before they were extinguished. The models in this question were Amtrak Genesis P42DC series and two F40PHs, surprisingly had a good safety record. Unit numbers 819, 312, and 262 were all but demolished with smashed glass and ripped up wires. Some people were killed by anaphylactic shock from hitting the wires when they were trapped in the water for 20 minutes after the collision subsided. Others were killed by alligators and snake in the infested waters. Others suffered 5th and 6th degree burns from flames and smoke inhalation related damages. After the wreck and confirmation from the NTSB, Odom was laid off, but not prosecuted, because he wasn't on drugs or alcohol when the wreck occurred. At the time, he had no prior criminal charges, even though he failed his vision test 8 times. He remains hopeful that he will seek forgiveness from not only his victims, but the railroads as well. He is determined to motivate his errors to teach the young youth not to make the same mistakes he made prior to September 22nd of 1993. David Hawkins, CBS News, Mobile. Railroad dangers continue to be a maximal problem to FRA officials and NTSB investigators. 500,000 acres could be in jeopardy if the freight trains were hauling hazardous material. The Federal Emergency Management Agency has also contacted crew members and even issued 3 critical wrecks on the cataclysmically fatal encounters of the 5th kind. We have 3 reports. We begin our first report with CBS's correspondent Mark Phillips.
With states announcing mandatory evacuations for train wrecks from boiling liquid evaporated vapor expanding vapor explosions, NTSB officials are freaking out like roaches to safely announce the evacuation of several hundreds to hundreds of thousands of residents from their homes. Ledger, Montana had its horrific encounters of the 5th kind. 2 freight trains in August 30th of 1991 crashed in one of the most cataclysmically head-on collisions in state history. Similar to the wreck at Helena in 1989, but with more critical and maximal damages, the wreckage of 9 locomotives, including half a dozen of general-purpose 38-2 low-noses and a trio of special-duty 40-2s were all total at the scene of the wreck. Some of the info about the models may be incorrect, but since the report by the crew was scarce, fearing violations of confidentiality, gave their opinions in best versions possible. Ledger, Montana was jolted by a hazmat collision, claiming water was not allowed for extinguishing the flames due to calcium carbide in one of the high-Q boxcars. Dangerous when wet caution signs were mandatory at the time of the crash, which took place at around 5:50 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. The combined speed due to maximal computer errors which crashed from connection servers was reported at a combined speed of 87 miles per hour. The force of the collision buckled under the frames and sheared the radiators and melted the turbocharged and its generators off the locomotive. Temperatures reached over 4,500 degrees due to center beam and bulkhead flat cars filled with lumber and logs from bound to the area sawmills, and red and yellow phosphorus igniting with instantaneously no flashpoint, along with half a dozen coil and tank cars filled with flammable solids and liquids and corrosive additives. Total cars demolished 29, 14 from train 602 and 15 from 603. Again, all 9 locomotives were all but demolished. 3 of the GP38-2s and 2 of the SD40-2s were corroded from acid splashing and sloshing around the bodies of the locomotives. A huge 1,600-foot cloud of smoke engulfed the town and forced nearly 500,000 residents evacuated to what had become their homes. 22 houses were burned along with some fire rescue personnel. 3 crew members were killed and 5 of them injured. 2 of them was seriously injured, and 1 of them with severe injuries. The other one suffered from burns that reached between the 4th, 5th, and 6th degree. He was immediately rushed to an intensive burn unit where he stayed over 3 years in the most traumatic part of the hospital. He was discharged in May of '94. In a 60 Minutes interview with Ed Bradley in '96, the crewman described the injuries worse as what happened to Lester Foster, a surviving crew member of the Cajon Pass wreck of '96. Only his head suffered first-degree burns at the time of the wreck. He was trapped for 16 hours before he was finally rescued. He also stated the worst part was trying not to swallow the infectious smoke. His arms and legs were all amputated from the burns suffered from the near-fatal trauma of the corrosive acid that nearly burned him for nearly 10 minutes. EMS immediately attended to cover the 6th-degree burns from getting affected. Everywhere else was either burned, cracked, bruised, or hyperextended horrifically. He also mentioned that he looked like a rag doll after he got out of the hospital. After surviving almost 20 surgeries from his 3-year extent, he is permanently retired from the railroads, saying radio equipment flawed with software errors must be replaced after wiring was chewed up and signals broken down. But here at Ledger, the scene is always more quieter than it was 30 years ago. But the fatal dangers of lack of communication proved that faulty equipment on the type of anything is beyond negligent and inexcusable. Burlington Northern at the time had settled this in a federal court lawsuit, finding the railroad in excess over $19 million. Mark Phillips, CBS News, Ledger, Montana.
I'll be back later on 60 Minutes too for a one-on-one with Robert Lobby and Jerry Hall, former president, founder, and CEO of Operation Lifesaver, to conduct the fatal dangers of playing chicken and unlawful road games at railroad crossings. For now, Dan Rather is back in Bryan, Ohio, with more stories on train wreck trauma and damages. Dan?
Thanks, Scott Pelley from the former 60 Minutes 2 and our news headquarters in New York. Burlington Northern also suffered an even more critical spit in the face with another critical wreck equally traumatic as the one at Ledger. 9th Smith's wreck on April 25th of 1985 proved equally critical to use locomotives with upgraded underframes, comfort cab technology to avoid collisions. CBS's Mark Strassman reports on how deadly construction of underframes can be when they don't meet specifications for FRA safety requirements. In tonight's Eye on America.
These are the remains of several Burlington Northern locomotives from 2208, 1815, 1950, 2231, 1778, 1705, and 8071. All have been totaled, including the 1778, which suffered a snapped underframe. Since the wreck in 1985, railroads across the U.S. and Canada have fully adapted new locomotives with upgraded underframe technology and rebuilt from the GP20 series. Other technologies included modernized and enhancements on wide and comfort cabs from the 40-8s, 40-9s, and 41-9 series of models. The 39-8s also had enhancements to reduce or eliminate clogged fuel solids in the injector lines. For example, unburned fuel will clog in the manifold. Unfortunately, when engineers sit from idle to notch 4, the fuel will catch flames and burn out the turbocharger. Even the enhanced models have its share of errors as well. NTSB videos show the graphic impact when locomotives go through crash course impact to pass testing. Operations have continued even today after gruesome circumstances. As wrecks continue to impact the nation's railroads, more citizens are putting General Electrics and moving away from the general purpose models of locomotives. Special duty equipment has either sold or converted of its remaining of its high hood to low nose power. Showing better visibility for the crew and later introductions to isolated cab technology allowed Conrail in 94 to continue operations before the assets were liquidated and split by NCSX. Other railroads like Burlington Northern and affiliates and predecessors like ICG, Wisconsin Central, and the Northwestern, and even fallen flags such as Chessie and the Seaboard Systems, and other railroads, have stepped up their games in the last number of decades before their demise, with other fallen flags like Kansas City Southern and Missouri Pacific stepping up their game with Union Pacific, and other roads like Western Pacific and Oregon Shortline. They are also stepping up the game to protect railroads from being demolished and sold in scrap metal. Construction has never been this cataclysmically critical for locomotives to succeed in the market. In Naismith, Montana, I'm Mark Strassman for Eye on America.